When I drove the Toyota GR86 manual, I said that this is not suitable to be driven every day. However, after having spent a week in the Subaru BRZ automatic, my opinion on the matter has changed. Now, like the GR86, the Subaru BRZ also benefits from an updated engine. So up front, the Boxer has grown from 2 litres to 2.4, and it now produces 237 PS and 250 Newton meters of torque. 0 to 100 in the automatic takes just 6.8 seconds, whereas in the manual, you can get that down to 6.3, although that is largely to do with how quickly you can shift the gears. Now, in terms of styling, there are very few differences between the two, and it really is blink and you'll miss it. So for example, on the Subaru, we get horizontal slats up covering the grille rather than the sort of mesh design that we got from the 86. You still get full LED headlights replete with automatic high beam as well as beam swiveling, which means that it's actually dependent on the direction of the steering wheel. And so theoretically, the lights can actually see around corners, which is certainly very helpful when you're driving a car like this very quickly. However, I am starting to agree with fans of the previous generation that the face of the last gen car was a little bit more distinctive. However, I do think that the overall front-end design of the BRZ is a bit more mature, and I do think that this ultimately looks absolutely stunning. Now, moving down the side, rolling stock is handled by a set of 18-inch alloy wheels wrapped in Michelin Pilot Sport 5 tyres, which are suitably high performance given the performance on offer with this car. Now, compared to the outgoing vehicle, the old BRZ used to get very basic tyres, the kind of thing that you'd get for a Toyota Prius, for example. But for the new generation, given the fact that this car is now more powerful, they've decided to fit performance tires on this car to give it a little bit better grip. Now, as we move further down, that more mature design extends to the overall profile of the car, because I do think that the new BRZ looks significantly better than the old one. You now get these air breathers down the side, which help to break up the monotony of the design, and also it helps airflow in order to help cool the brakes. As we move further down, you get very pronounced side sills, and they rise up to these very pronounced rear haunches, which, by the way, are always visible in your rear view mirrors, provided you set them up properly. And as far as I'm concerned, this looks absolutely fantastic. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you may have noticed a small badge on the fender, and that is for EyeSight, because the automatic vehicles, the automatic Subaru BRZ and actually the automatic Toyota GR86, both get the same EyeSight ADAS functionality, but on the Subaru, you actually get an EyeSight badge here, which means that those who know will know you bought the automatic. And as we move to the rear, I think this is perhaps one of the best angles of the new BRZ, and that has largely to do with the way they've resolved the taillight design back here. So now these are full LED taillights replete with LED indicators, and I do quite like this boomerang style design with this little piece of black garnish that stretches all the way across the boot lid, which helps to emphasize the width of this car. And also from this angle, you'll be able to see those very powerful, very wide haunches at the rear, because after all, this is a rear wheel driven sports car. I also like the fact that you have this integrated ducktail spoiler, which I think makes this car look absolutely fantastic. And even though this bumper is quite chunky, it is at least broken up by the rear diffuser as well as the large diameter tailpipes. On top of that, you get the reverse lights and fog lights neatly integrated into the bumper down here. And I will say that having the dual reverse lights really does help when you're reversing at night, because it provides a good view and a good splash of light for the reverse camera to see. Now, behind this tailgate, unfortunately, there is one significant difference between the Subaru and the Toyota, and that has to do with the spare tire. Now, both cars actually get a full-size spare as standard, which is good. The only trouble is both of them sit proud of the boot floor, which means that you have about an inch or an inch and a half of tire that sits above the boot floor. Now, in the Toyota, they actually have the decency to cover this with a bit of carpet, but in the Subaru, they don't. It's just there, which means that putting luggage into this is a little bit of a challenge, and I have noticed that it's quite hard to keep things out of the rim itself. And so when I put stuff in the back of this car, I usually just end up putting my laptop bag in the wheel, and I'm pretty sure that that's not all that great for my laptop. Now, in terms of the overall size, I do think that this is slightly less usable than what you get in the Toyota Supra, which is interesting, despite the fact that this car actually has rear seats somehow I don't think that this is that usable a space. However, those rear seats can be folded flat 50-50, obviously, because there are only 2 back seats, and then you do get a little bit more space, but overall, I don't think this is all that practical. Also, just in case you're one of those strange people who are looking at this as like a golf club car, the boot opening is not that wide, which means that putting a set of golf bags in here is going to be a little bit more challenging than it would be in something else. But then again, if you are looking for a car to just drive the golf club, maybe buy a Lexus. I do also quite like the interior of the BRZ because, for example, the upholstery on these seats are exactly what you want out of a performance car. You've got the leather inserts on the side, but the center is mostly done in this sort of microfiber material. And although you do have some red stitching and red accents along the seat, they are also mirrored in the perforations of that microfiber material in the middle. And so I do think this looks quite cohesive, and they're also very comfortable and very supportive, although you do not get lumbar support on the driver's seat or indeed the passenger seat. On top of that, Subaru has resisted from making this car look too racy like the GR86 by including red inserts on the doors, which I think look a little bit too boy racer for my taste. But at least that microfiber material actually extends onto the door cards themselves, which means that even leaning your arm here is quite a comfortable affair. The same goes down here. We have nice padding and more contrast stitching on the doors. So I do think that this is a pretty well specified interior for what it is. However, if you do reach around, you will notice that there is quite a bit of hard plastic in this car. So for example, the cowling around the air conditioning vents, that's hard plastic. This bit of the door trim, that's also hard plastic, and obviously further down around your knees, that's also hard plastic. But these are all mostly areas that either you do not touch or they are areas that need to be harder wearing, and so I understand the use of that. But at least the dash top itself is quite soft, and you get more of that microfiber material up here, which, as you can see, I have been rather obsessively ensuring that it remains nice and flat. Now, moving from that, we have to talk about the digital displays, because in this car there are 2. You get a central infotainment system here, which runs a very rudimentary system. They call it Subaru Starlink. And as far as I'm concerned, although it's not the most reactive system in the world, it does what you need it to do very well. So for example, your Apple CarPlay and Android Auto does display on the entirety of the screen, although it is a wired connection which comes through this center console bin here, which means that you always have a wire hanging around. I've actually resorted to using a wireless dongle to make that work. Now, this works quite well, and this is paired to a pretty decent sound system. Now, when I drove the GR86, in all honesty, the sound system in that car was so ludicrously bad that I ended up not really listening to music as I drove around. But for some reason, although this car uses essentially the same hardware, the sound system in this car is pretty good. Now, beyond this, you also get a semi-digital instrument cluster up ahead of you. So there is a small TFT screen that is set slightly towards the left, as well as digital display on the right. And this display is pretty decent as far as I'm concerned. You have some pretty good animations which kind of play on this car's boxer engine, which I think looks quite good. And as far as I'm concerned, you get all the information that you want displayed very quickly and very neatly, and so it's very easy to understand what's going on at any given time. So that's certainly a good thing. As we move further down, another good thing is the fact that this car does come with dual zone climate control with actual knobs that work. And in order to save space, they've actually put screens in the middle of these knobs, which means that, again, it's very easy for you to change your temperature or change your fan speed and actually see what you're doing. However, underneath that comes a bit of a sore point in this car, and that is to do with these little buttons that live down here. Now, while it's very nice that they're tactile in the sense that you know what you're pressing and how to press them, the buttons themselves are also quite large. The problem is they do feel a little bit flimsy. And for a car like this, which is in excess of 250,000 ringgit, although it is cheaper than the Toyota, it still doesn't really fill me with a lot of confidence. And this is particularly annoying given the fact that Subaru is known for very high quality interiors, at least within the price range. And so I am disappointed that this is built like this, although I'm pretty sure a Subaru engineer will tell me that it was designed for lightness. Whatever. As we move further down, this is your gear lever for the 6-speed automatic gearbox. Now, one of the things I appreciate about this is there is no release button. Instead, there is a sort of motion for you to move it back and forth. And so that actually provides a pretty good amount of tactility in terms of changing gears or swapping direction. So I really appreciate that hugely. You also get a manual gear lever here, because apparently that's important for customers of performance cars like these. But further down, you get a slightly more interesting set of buttons. So back here, you find the buttons for your heated seats. as well as buttons here that actually control the way the car drives. So there is a track mode, a sport mode, and a snow mode, as well as a traction control off button. Now, of course, because this is the BRZ, it doesn't come with Subaru's symmetrical all-wheel drive system, which means that with these buttons in place with a certain degree of settings and so on, you can actually get this car to do really leery things, although you shouldn't. Now, beyond that, there is more switchgear on the steering wheel, which comes with a set of paddle shifters to manipulate that 6-speed auto box. You get some physical buttons to control the majority of your entertainment functions, etc., which is all very nice, as well as a small stalk down here to control your cruise control. Now, this car actually comes with adaptive cruise control. You can change the settings for that up here, but your speed, etc., is all controlled via this little stalk. Now, at least this is very tactile, and the stalk is always visible, which is certainly better than what we've seen from certain other car makers, so I appreciate that they thought about that. Moving further to the right, you get your adjustment for the brightness for both of the screens, as well as your boot release, as well as a set of buttons for your window controls and your mirror controls and locking and unlocking the doors. Now, as far as I'm concerned, this interior is actually set up really good for what it is. It's just a bit of a shame that some parts of this cabin really let the side down. I would have appreciated some slightly better materials, for example, in places that you will be touching more often, like here. Surely they could have made this into a soft touch material, and these buttons could have been slightly higher quality, I think. Now, as to save myself the embarrassment, I'm not going to get into the back seat to discuss them. However, I will say that for my frame at 170 centimeters, with the seat set in my driving position, there is actually just enough space for me to sit back there with my knees basically pressed against the front seats, although I have no headroom. Now, if you have passengers that require no headroom, like children, you can actually fit them back there because there are ISOFIX mounts. Although that said, because the rear windscreen actually comes up to over where your head sits, on a very hot day, that's direct sunlight. So be aware of what that means. And also there is no ISOFIX mount on the front seat, which I think is a little bit interesting given the fact that you can get an ISOFIX mount for the passenger seat on a Toyota Supra, which means that once again, the more expensive car is also more practical. But to that end, talking about practicality, you actually have a decently sized glove box here with a nice sort of soft damp opening, which is nice. You get a couple of cup holders here, as well as a couple of USB ports and an aux jack, if you still know what that is and you have a phone that still has one. I do. And the door bins are actually decently sized, so you can actually put a litre-sized bottle in here without too much issue, although I've ended up just putting sort of my wallet and my cards in here. On top of that, it is worth pointing out that this car doesn't come with a wireless charger, even in this little sort of cubby hole here, which is also where I've resorted to putting my sunglasses. Now, I suppose that's all right, given the fact the head unit doesn't offer wireless Apple CarPlay or Android Auto, but it would have been nice. Although again, I find myself waffling on about practical considerations in a sports car. I know that very few of you actually care, because what matters is what this car is like to drive. Now, for those of you who may not have seen our review of the Toyota GR86, which we reviewed as a manual first, I did mention the fact that it was very much a sports car in the sense that it required a lot of compromise in terms of daily driving, which meant that vehicles like the Toyota Supra were slightly better fit for that purpose. However, driving the Subaru BRZ has revealed a slightly different end of that personality. Now, I don't think it's just down to the automatic gearbox, although obviously this does make a huge difference in terms of driving this car daily. But I also think that it has to do with the suspension geometry on this car. Now, before I picked this car up, I actually spoke to a few other industry colleagues who have driven both cars back to back to sort of understand maybe some of the subtleties and nuances that they experienced driving the cars back to back, to see mostly if their opinions were right and if I felt the same thing. Driving the BRZ does reveal the fact that there is significant changes to the way this car is set up to drive in terms of its dynamics. The gearbox and throttle response are very similar in both cars, and so that's not really the point of differentiation. Instead, the difference actually comes from the way this car responds to steering inputs and so on. So after having driven this car about 600 kilometers at this point, was it 500, something like that? Through a variety of different circumstances, a variety of different situations, including a few roads that were designed specifically in order to test this car's dynamics, I have found that the BRZ feels like a much calmer place to be. Where I found the 86 to be very skittish and very overtly attentive, where it becomes very difficult for you to sort of just relax in that car. The BRZ, I feel, is a lot more neutral and a little bit more accessible to more drivers. So when you just need to cart the car around and get to and from appointments and stuff like that, the BRZ is much better at calming down in terms of how the throttle responds and how the steering input works. And so it does mean that this car feels a lot more usable on a day-to-day basis. And one may argue that yes, that does mean that there is some degree of dynamic compromise over the GR86. I don't think that that compromise is something that anyone's really going to be able to notice, because the differences in this car are very, very subtle. And so when I did take this car out on slightly more enthusiastic roads with slightly more enthusiastic driving, I did find this car to be just as rewarding to drive. It feels very much like a sports car. It's still scalpel sharp. It's still incredibly reactive and responsive. And so it feels like, to me, you're getting the best of both worlds without any real compromise in any one direction. So yes, the BRZ is the calmer of the two cars, but I don't think that it suffers as a result. And that's certainly a good thing. On top of that, the BRZ, automatic at least, coming with this EyeSight system, although the same can be said of the Toyota GR86 automatic, means that in terms of daily drivability, because the EyeSight ADAS system is so capable, it just means that when you are stuck in, less than ideal traffic conditions, the car is still usable and functional and still calm and relaxing to drive. I will, however, point out the fact that because this car uses a manual handbrake, it does mean that the car won't hold itself in traffic as adeptly as a vehicle with an electronic parking brake. And so while the car will bring itself to a stop, it will only stop for about 3 to 5 seconds or something like that. It will beep at you and then it will disengage the adaptive cruise control. And so you always need to be ready to put your foot on the brake to stop the car from rolling forwards. But I think that is a relatively small compromise in order to get the sort of systems and safety functionalities that this car offers, particularly given the fact that up until very recently, even the Toyota Corolla Cross didn't offer full-speed adaptive cruise control. And so I think this is perfectly fine. And now, of course, I have to start talking about this car's dynamic prowess, because obviously that is what most of you are watching this video are watching it for. Now, of course, I can't demonstrate that to you right now because it is drizzling and it's also the federal highway and I'm not an absolute maniac. But this does actually provide me the opportunity to talk to you about how this car felt to drive on those B roads. So for starters, the way this car reacts to driver input is truly outstanding. It is so responsive, it's so agile, and even though this car is a little bit heavier than the outgoing model, it doesn't feel it at all. Sat in the driver's seat, this car feels so reactive, so responsive, and so much fun. It feels like you're driving a feather almost. Because of this car's wheelbase and where you're sat very cabin rearward, it actually feels, whenever you put in steering input, it feels like you're pivoting from the waist, which is very similar a sensation as to what I experienced in the Toyota Supra, which also has a shorter wheelbase, mind you. And so because of that, it just feels like the car reacts to driver input in a very natural way, almost like a go-kart. And that is certainly a good thing, particularly in a performance car. Additionally, because this car is so small, it does also mean that when you are trying to thread it through traffic like I am now, it just feels perfectly at home. This car is no more difficult to drive than a Myvi thereabouts, which is probably why the overall dimensions of this car are not too dissimilar to that of a Myvi, in fact. And so it just makes for a very pleasant driving experience. And pleasant is not necessarily something that you would attach to a vehicle like this, a car that clearly prioritizes performance, driving dynamics, and lightness above all other considerations. And when you're done driving enthusiastically and it's time to get back on the motorway to get home in a timely fashion, you realize very quickly that, again, because of the way this car's suspension is set up, it calms down a lot better. When you're traveling on B roads and driving enthusiastically, you'll appreciate the fact this car is relatively stiffly sprung, although not to the point of it being uncomfortable. Although the rebound rate in this car, the secondary ride in this car, is on the stiffer side of things, naturally, as you would expect from a vehicle of this class. But when you're on the motorway, because the primary ride in this car is very well set up, it just means that it soaks up the lumps and bumps in a really natural, very comfortable, very reasonable sort of fashion, which makes this a surprisingly usable car in more ways than you might necessarily expect. Now, Before I leave you and give you my overall opinion of the car, I have to also talk about the practical considerations. As I mentioned earlier, this car comes as standard with Subaru EyeSight in the automatic model, and so that gives you things like adaptive cruise control, which is what I'm using now, lane departure alert, blind spot monitoring, as well as pedestrian detection, etc. You also get the swiveling headlights that I mentioned earlier, which allow you to see further around corners, which is certainly very nice. Although it is worth pointing out that this car does not come with a 360 camera, instead you just have a reverse camera, although I think that's hardly that big of a deal. And so overall, what do I think of the Subaru BRZ? I'm actually very surprised that I'm arriving at this conclusion not feeling the same way I did about the GR86. This car just feels a lot more usable in a lot more scenarios, which makes this a proper daily drivable sports car, which is exactly the brief for this model in the first place. I think that the GR86 strayed a little bit too far towards being a driver's car, that it stopped really being very good at being a car, whereas this car seems to balance it a lot better. The Subaru BRZ and the 86 may look identical on paper, but in reality, driving them day to day reveals a very different personality to this car. So would I recommend this at under 300,000 ringgit? Absolutely. Given the fact that this car naturally competes against the Golf GTI as well as various other hot hatches within the space, I will say that yes, this is not as practical as a GTI, nor is it as comfortable as a GTI. But I do think that for a driving machine, this car does provide more satisfaction, particularly in terms of the way the car reacts to driver inputs and that overall sensation from behind the wheel. I think that this is the much better car to drive. However, if you do actually need back seats and a usable boot, then you may be better served again by the Volkswagen Golf GTI, which was updated a couple of years ago to also offer a level 2 semi-autonomy system just like the BRZ, although that car can actually come to a complete stop and hold itself there because it uses an electronic parking brake. And of course, if you think that 300,000 ringgit ought to buy you a more practical car, then please by all means do what everybody else does and buy a BMW 3 Series. Because the new 3 Series is not as sharp to drive as the pre-LCI model, but it's still a pretty decent car to drive, and you know, it's a luxury car and it's got all the luxury car trappings and stuff like that. And so if you're that kind of buyer, then that's the kind of car that you'd appreciate more. But as far as I'm concerned, the BRZ really has gotten under my skin. I'm surprised by just how much I like this car because I certainly didn't expect it. And when you pair that very amenable driving experience to the fact that this car just looks absolutely sensational to me, it just means that this is a very easy car for me to recommend. And I'm now trying to find ways to sell my very hard-working videographer so that I can buy one, although that might also spell the end of the channel. In any case, that concludes our review of the Subaru BRZ Automatic. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon so you're notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the description below, including the link to join our new WhatsApp channel. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe and jangan bodoh.